Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you're joining from. Firstly, thank you very much for taking some time to join today's webinar. The webinar today is on the emerging topic of extended producer responsibility schemes for textiles. And specifically, the purpose of this webinar is to give an overview of the key considerations and international best practices for designing, implementing and somewhat operating the textiles EPR schemes themselves, with a little bit of a focus on the requirements of the revised European Union Waste Framework Directive, which is mandating textiles EPR schemes in all 27 EU countries. As a housekeeping point, I will mention that the webinar today is being recorded, and we will add it to our YouTube site and website so you can all see it afterwards. And of course, that allows anybody who has registered but is not able to join live to join the session and have a look at the content afterwards too. Firstly, I want to introduce the speakers so that you know who is speaking to you today. My name is Jordan Girling. I'm on the left-hand side of this slide that you're seeing right now, and I'm serving as Head of Extended Producer Responsibility at WRAP. And I'm joined by three lovely peers, one of them being Sophie Schopp. She is our Executive Director for Europe at WRAP. And I'm also joined by a couple of very strong technical experts from Policy Hub, Marina Espinola, Policy Director at Policy Hub, and Katerina from Policy Hub. She is the Public Affairs Manager, she's relatively new to Policy Hub. I think she's been there for 2 months, but she will correct me when it's her turn to come onto the screen. Regarding the content of the webinar, so what will we actually speak about? Firstly, we will be very, very brief on the first point, but we will give an overview of who WRAP are and also who Policy Hub are. And then we will move on to give a brief introduction of what extended producer responsibility actually is, and more specifically, why is EPR being applied to textiles. Then we'll dive into a bit more detail around the mandatory adoption of textiles EPR schemes in the European Union, before we jump into a bigger picture overview of the EU Circular Economy Act and the very recent updates to the Environment Omnibus. And then from my side, I will give some overview about the key considerations and best practices for designing the textiles EPR schemes so that they are designed in a way where they are effective and impactful. And then our peers at Policy Hub, they will give some insights into industry perspectives that influence policy direction. And then towards the end of the session, we will talk a little bit about how we have helped design textiles EPR schemes before. During the session, questions are permitted, so we encourage you to submit questions through the Q&A function throughout the session, and we have prompts for ourselves to look at that and answer some of the questions throughout the entire process rather than just at the end. We do anticipate that there will probably be quite a lot of questions, so regardless of how many questions we are trying to answer, we will try and keep on track and flow through. But regardless, submit your questions, and if we don't answer them live, we will do our best to answer them after the session. And so who are WRAP? Who's actually presenting to you today? And now is a good time for me to pass to my colleague Sophie, who will give an overview about who WRAP are. Sophie, over to you.
Yes, thank you, Jordan. Indeed, great if we can already move to this slide. Just to start at the beginning, WRAP stands for Waste and Resources Action Program. And I think that says already quite specifically what we focus on. We focus on preventing and reducing waste across the globe. We do that through systemic change and a key focus on hands-on data-driven action. We're also calling or referring to ourselves as an action NGO, and we are a community of doers focused on not only implementation, but also advising both policymakers, businesses, and also citizens, because we focus quite a bit on behavior change as this is such a key part of driving change. We focus not only on textiles, but also on food, packaging, and the circular economy in general. We work through pacts and coalitions across the globe, and that is what you can see on the nice map that we have on this slide. And that's also where you can see that our projects are live in over 50 countries. We work with, I think by now it's around 1,000 organizations worldwide, with a team that's, well, for the largest chunk still based in the UK, but also rapidly extending across the globe with an increasing team in the US, led by our executive director for the Americas, a small team in the EU, and also an increasing team in APAC. I think it's safe to say I joined RAP in June of this year. That's also when we relaunched our presence or our entity in Europe. And the reason for this is that we see such a clear need for hands-on work on the ground, especially if we talk about textiles around durability and EPR. So I'm really excited to deep dive today into what EPR means. And Jordan is one of our 300 colleagues with whom we do this work. And that's another thing I really love about working for RAP. We do most of the work we do in-house, and that ranges from research to very hands-on specific projects, measurement, and tests with businesses across the globe. I think, yeah, before saying anything more, there's an open invitation to connect on what we do in Europe. Always happy to jump on a call or have a coffee, because I'm a professional coffee drinker, and happy to jump on the Eurostar. Before handing over to Jordan, though, I would like to give the floor to Marina to briefly explain what the Policy Hub is doing, if you don't already know.
Thank you very much, Sophie and Jordan, and very much appreciating having the opportunity to be here and to discuss with you, but also with everyone, the implementation of EPR schemes for textiles. It also shows, by the number of people that they are joining, it also shows the importance of having this conversation and how many questions we are having on the topic. Very briefly on our side as well, just to explain the work we are doing, who we are. So we are an organization based in Brussels, both Katarina and myself, we are based here in Brussels, with the objective of solidifying and establishing this table, this conversation with all the actors in the textile value chain, and gather representatives from the global textile value chain sector, from recyclers, suppliers, manufacturers, to brands for all market segments, to have a technical conversation on what are the realities of the sector and what needs to be taken into consideration when having a conversation with European institutions on how to implement those pieces of legislation that are currently being discussed in different stages, but that are impacting the sustainability of the textile sector. So we were created in 2019, so we are quite a recent organization, but we have been engaging with the European institutions, notably with the European Commission, but also with the European Parliament and Council, on key pieces of legislation such as, eco-design for sustainable process of regulation, but also Waste Framework Directive since the beginning. And now we are very much engaged on everything related to the implementation of EPR schemes and what is needed to make of this something that is ambitious, that is implementable, and that also takes into account the realities of the sector. If you can move, Jordan, maybe to the next slide, just a very brief overview of who makes a Policy Hub. So you see our founding members is Cascale, Global Fashion Agenda, and Federation of European Sporting Goods Industry. But we also have the expertise and knowledge of our advisory group. You see here the most recent updated list, so Textile Exchange, Fashion for Good, the Organic Cotton Accelerator, SLCP, Better Cotton, Fair Labor, GOTS quite recently. But we also have these more than 45 individual members. So all together with all the brands representing more from the group, the parent companies, and if we take into account all the numbers, we are more than 700 indirect members. So yeah, let's go into the details for EPR.
Thank you very much, Marina and Sophie. So as promised, we will give a bit of an overview about what extended producer responsibility actually is. I'm sure you're all aware, hence you joining the session, but just in case you're not, I will give a quick summary. But how I usually like to define extended producer responsibility is with this term at the top of the screen. So extended producer responsibility is a regulatory mechanism used to finance the costs associated to the sustainable management of a product or its packaging once it reaches its end of life, by placing such costs on product manufacturers and sellers, i.e. the producers. But there is a lot of different definitions about what extended producer responsibility is. This one is from the Product Stewardship Institute, based out of the US. They define EPR as a mandatory type of product stewardship required by law, and it includes, at a minimum, the requirement that the manufacturer's responsibility for its product extends to post-consumer management of that product or its packaging. The Prevent Waste Alliance, they define EPR as an environmental policy approach based on obliging producers to assume full responsibility for their products, both during the useful life cycle and during the end of life phase, once the product and packaging become waste. The Sustainable Packaging Organization, from also headquartered in the US, they describe EPR as a policy approach that assigns producers responsibility for the end of life of products, and that can include both financial responsibility and operational responsibility through the amount, though the amount and type may differ, and producers are required to provide funding and/or services that assist in managing covered products after the use phase. And here is a definition from Circular Action Alliance. Here is a definition from Source Intelligence. Don't worry, I won't read through all of these. The purpose of this slide is to highlight that there is no clear industry-wide accepted definition of what EPR is. But in general, if you want a simple one sentence, use the line at the top of the slide, because I am biased and that's how I define EPR. EPR, it can be implemented for most problematic waste streams in a specific country or region, and it has been implemented for a lot of different types of products already in countries around the world, as you can see from this slide. So it has largely been implemented for things like electronic products, product packaging, batteries and end-of-life vehicles in many countries around the world. And many other countries have adopted EPR for other problematic waste streams in their country or region. So, for example, California has EPR for paint and carpets. France has the most EPR schemes around the world. I can't remember the exact number, but they have it for things like toys and DIY equipment, sports equipment, as well as the traditional packaging, batteries and Wii. Minnesota has EPR for boat wrap. Ontario has EPR for gas canisters. I won't go through all of these, but you see the picture. The EPR can be applied to most products and most types of packaging. EPR for textiles. Why do we need extended producer responsibility for textiles? And this slide is here to help me exhibit the scale of the problem, i.e. what's the environmental and climate impacts of used and waste textiles. Therefore, why does it indicate that we need a policy mechanism like EPR to better manage used and waste textiles that are rising on the market? So we know that 8 to 10% of global greenhouse gas emissions come from clothing and footwear. And we know that the EU, they generate 12.6 million tons of textile waste per year. That's a huge amount, but not quite as huge as the US, who generate 17 million tons of textile waste per year. The value lost every year due to clothing underutilization and lack of recycling is $460 billion. And it has the fourth highest impact on environment and climate change in Europe. And last, but certainly not least on this slide, the percentage of material currently recycled into new clothing is just 1%, which is an extremely small number. So a policy mechanism, something like EPR, that can help to increase the recycled content into new clothing and help us to mitigate some of these massive environmental and climate impacts. But despite the massive impacts that textiles have on the environment and climate, EPR for textiles has been quite uncommon. At the beginning of last year, only France had an EPR scheme, but that is quite dramatically changing around the world, particularly in Europe. And that is happening in Europe partly because of the new EU strategy for sustainable and circular textiles and the very recently adopted revised Waste Framework Directive. And this slide gives a few examples of some existing textiles EPR schemes to help me articulate what they actually look like to you as the audience. Firstly, for the Netherlands, a textiles EPR decree in the Netherlands, it gave producers obligations from January 2025. And under that decree, producers are obligated to prepare a proportion of collected textiles for reuse and recycling, 50%, and ensure a proportion of the textiles are reused within the Netherlands directly, which is 10%, and ensure a proportion undergo fibre-to-fibre recycling directly, so 25% there, which is a massive jump from the 1% we saw on the previous slide. The scope is things like consumer clothing, workwear, and household textiles. Unsold stock that has not been placed on the market, that's not covered by the obligations, whereas returned products that have been placed on the market are. The EPR fee for textile products in the Netherlands is 24 eurocents per kilogram. And they define obligated producers, in inverted commas, as the party that's the first to offer textile products professionally in the Netherlands. They have the obligations. And this also obligates foreign companies that sell textile products directly to customers in the Netherlands. Coming to France, you probably all heard about France's Textiles EPR scheme because they are indeed the pioneer of Textiles EPR, and they've had the scheme operating since, I think, 2008. The scheme is made up largely of clothing, around 83% of the scheme. 9% of the scheme is household linens and 8% is footwear. And the vast majority, 95% of obligated producers, they are a member of the Refashion Collective Pro, the producer responsibility organisation. Of course, they charge EPR fees under France's scheme, and they also eco-modulate the fees, which means they try to incentivize more recyclable or more sustainable products from the first instance by eco-modulating the EPR fees themselves. And there are 3 eco-modulation levels, one of which aims to encourage the design of more durable textile products, and one of which aims to encourage the integration of recycled materials. And there is a little example on this slide. So products with 15% recycled fibres sourced from post-consumer textiles, they can receive a 50% EPR fee discount in France, which is, as you can imagine, a massive incentive. And there are also some product labelling requirements in France, as you probably know, around the Tryman logo and the sorting instructions, which need to go on the products through a label itself, but also the packaging of the products too. And then the last example for this slide before I continue on with the presentation. California has recently adopted a textiles EPR scheme through Senate Bill 707, and that was passed back in September 2024. And the scheme will be fully implemented by July 2028. The scope is clothing and accessory items intended for regular wear or formal occasions and outdoor activities. There are some exemptions, so specifically sellers of second-hand clothing and sellers with less than $1 million global turnover are exempted. The penalties if you don't comply and you're identified as being non-compliant are pretty huge, up to $50,000 per day of non-compliance. The scheme does make some good incentives to try and prioritise reuse. So There are requirements for the producer responsibility organisation, i.e. the body which controls and operates the scheme. Their operational plans, they must include incentive payments and grants, market development investments to encourage reuse over recycling methods where at all possible. There's some other requirements for the Pro too. They must provide a certain number of collection points per number of inhabitants in California. It's also mandatory for them to eco-modulate fees to try and incentivize more sustainable and recyclable products entering the market. And lastly, but certainly not least, like I will say over and over again, online marketplaces, they must notify the Pro of all sellers with a turnover exceeding a certain threshold so that the Pro can check that those sellers are indeed registered in the scheme and paying their EPR fees that are due from them. And this is quite an important section of the webinar. I will talk about the mandatory adoption of textile EPR schemes in all EU countries. So the first overview slide of the mandatory EPR schemes for textiles across Europe. First of all, the EU strategy for sustainable and circular textiles, that was published back in March 2022. And in line with the strategy, a proposal to revise the EU Waste Framework Directive, that's what would require the mandatory adoption of textile EPR schemes, that was published back in July 2023. And that revision, it was published on 9th of September this year, 2025, and it had its final adoption during early October. And it mandates all EU countries adopt and implement EPR schemes for textiles. Regarding the timelines, within 30 months of Waste Framework Directive finalisation, each EU country must adopt their national schemes. So in reality, all EU countries will be required to have an operational textiles EPR scheme by the end of March 2028. And quite notably, micro enterprises will have a 12-month compliance deferral period. So they will not be required to comply with the schemes as soon as they become operational. They will have an additional 1-year grace period to comply. The European Commission's 2030 vision for textiles is that all products placed on the EU market are durable, repairable, and recyclable. The Commission, they will set design requirements for textiles to make them last longer, make them easier to repair and recycle, as well as requirements on minimum recycled content. Overproduction and overconsumption will be reversed, and there will be specific prohibition of the destruction of unsold textiles. And thirdly, illegal exports of textile waste to countries ill-equipped to manage it will be reduced or eliminated. And reusable, in inverted commas, textiles will be reclassified to stop waste exports being disguised as reuse exports when in practice the products may never be reused in practice. Therefore, they are waste exports rather than reuse exports. Regarding EPR fees that must be paid by producers and sellers of textile products, the fees must be paid on the product scope of the European Directive, which is apparel, clothing, accessories, blankets, rugs, household linen, curtains, hats, and footwear. And in the European Union, EPR fees, they will be charged on weight. Yes, we know that, but they will also be charged on per unit placed on the market if desirable, but definitely weight too. So that requirement to charge on weight, we know that will happen. In terms of per unit, that's to try and discourage things like ultra fast fashion, which try and sell huge amounts of products on the market at the same time. But I have a little note on my notes here as a side note. So Charging EPR fees on product weight, it has resulted in some slightly negative comments from some stakeholders, because charging EPR fees on weight can end up inadvertently incentivizing lightweighting of products, and that can make the products less durable, because the lighter the products, the smaller EPR fee they would pay, but therefore the lighter the products, the less durable they are, which is of course a direct thing that the directive is trying to avoid. We know that eco-modulation of EPR fees will be applied, where producers of harder to recycle products are charged higher fees and producers of easier to recycle products are charged lower fees. Eco criteria will probably primarily be based around product durability to try and discourage low durability fast fashion products. And eco-modulation criteria requirements will be set by forthcoming implementing acts of the revised Waste Framework Directive, and that will be based around forthcoming eco-design requirements for textiles per future delegated acts of ESPR. ESPR is an acronym for the European Eco-Design for Sustainable Products Regulation. So who are the obligated producers? Who actually has to pay these EPR fees that I keep referring to? Well, what you're seeing on the slide is the definition of an obligated producer, but I am purposely trying to simplify the definition of an obligated producer during this webinar. So the first bullet point, the first definition, that essentially captures textile product manufacturers that are based within the country of sale. The second definition tries to capture domestic brand owners and rebranders of products. The third definition tries to capture importers of textile products which are manufactured elsewhere. And lastly, the fourth definition is quite an important definition, and it captures foreign companies which distance sell directly to consumers. So, for example, a company based in China that sells to an end user in Belgium directly to their doorstep, they will have obligations because of this definition. A few other noteworthy points on the mandatory textiles EPR requirements in the European Union before I give you a break from my voice and pass over to some of my nicer colleagues. Firstly, the way in which producers register for EPR, that must be harmonised in the same format in every EU country, and the purpose is to try and minimise the the administrative burden on producers that are selling across numerous markets. It is mandatory for producers to join the collective producer responsibility organisation to fulfil their obligations. But again, I have a noteworthy point here that there's no minimum number of members for a pro to have. So theoretically, a producer could establish their own pro and be the only member. But that pro would still need to satisfy the same requirements as others, and that includes providing nationwide separate collection of textiles. So in reality, it's somewhat impractical to have independent pro. Like I mentioned before, used and waste textiles, they will be considered as waste upon collection. Although used clothes which are professionally assessed for reuse at the collection point, they will not be immediately considered as waste, which essentially captures clothes donated to a charity shop. And lastly, but certainly not least, textiles would be subject to sorting operations to ensure their treatment in line with the waste hierarchy, i.e. trying to prioritise things like reuse and repair before recycling is necessary. That is my last slide for this section, but my notes are prompting me to have a look at some questions, so I can answer one or two of those questions before I pass to some of my colleagues over at Policy Hub. Okay, there's a question here. What is the what's different about EU textiles EPR when compared with EU EPR for other types of products? And that's a really good question. They're generally quite similar, primarily because the national EPR schemes, they are led and driven by overarching European directives and regulations. Of course, the product scopes are very different, but you know that. That's probably not why you asked the question. One of the key differences is the compliance deferral period permitted for micro enterprises. That didn't happen in EPR schemes for other types of products around the EU. But probably I would say the biggest barrier, the biggest difference in my eyes, is the emphasis on waste hierarchy prioritization for textiles. So there's quite a lot of existing EPR schemes for other waste streams which have quite a strong emphasis on recycling. They don't necessarily prioritize the waste hierarchy. And that's partly a result of the wording that has a focus on recycling. So I try and give an example. The EU 2002 Waste Electrical and Electronic Equipment Directive, which sets EPR for electricals, that specifically sets targets where EU countries were required to meet WEEE recovery destined for recycling facilities. That was the specific target. So the national pros for WEEE, they focused around collecting for recycling to ensure that their targets were met. But in regards to textiles, the reuse of textiles before recycling, that's a pre-existing practice, and it's really important to try and preserve that. So that's one big difference for textiles EPR compared to EPR for other waste streams. Hopefully that answers your question. And then maybe I'll do one more before I pass over to Marina. There's a question about Minnesota for one of the earlier slides says that Minnesota needs EPR for boat wrap. What is boat wrap and why is it needed? Okay, very specific question, but fine. Minnesota has a lot of water. They border the US Great Lakes, so there's a lot of boats, as you can imagine. But it is also bordering Canada and it's central North America, so it gets very, very cold during the winter months. That essentially means all of the boats get wrapped up in this cling film type plastic to protect them during the winter from things like damp and salt water. And at the end of the winter, you have to discard all of that. So the EPR scheme is there to try and promote reuse, less reuse, but more recycling rather than direct disposal of things like plastic wrapping for the boats. Don't usually see that in most landlocked countries around the global north. Anyway, that's a very specific point. I won't spend any more time on that. I will stop talking and give you all a chance to listen to somebody else's voice, and I will pass over to Policy Hub to give an overview about the EU Circular Economy Act and the Environment Omnibus. Over to you.
Thank you, Jordan, for the great overview of the EU Textile EPR framework. So now we've established that the Waste Framework Directive is adopted and in force. So we turn to the question, what happens next? So in the next couple of slides, I'll just explain how this framework will be operationalized on member state level, and also the key elements of textile EPR schemes that could be further harmonized at the EU level before compliance is mandatory at national level, in order to make the overall system more effective across all member states. And I will also talk a little bit about which are those new upcoming legislative initiatives that are seen as a primary vehicle for this harmonization. Before we jump into the new upcoming harmonization initiatives, I'll just take one step back to quickly recap how member states now must make these EPR systems operational according to the Waste Framework Directive and the roles and responsibilities of the different actors within the system. So the Waste Framework Directive sets the core objectives and minimum requirements for EPR schemes. But because it is a directive, so it is a specific type of a legal instrument that does not prescribe exactly how these requirements must be implemented. So it's actually up to each member state. Member states have the flexibility to design their own national schemes as long as they meet the goals and those requirements set at EU level. So the schemes will vary one member state to another. So the main obligation coming from the Waste Framework Directive is for member states to ensure that producers have EPR for products that they make available on the market for the first time within their territory. So as Jordan already explained, in simple terms, producer is anyone who places textile or footwear products on the EU market for the first time. And when it comes to the obligation of producers, first, well, the member states need to ensure that they register in the national producer register of every member state where they make products available. And this register needs to be established and managed by each member state. No registration essentially means no market access in this member state. This is one part that the European Commission will work on harmonizing. So the Commission will adopt a harmonized format for registration in the register of producers in order to facilitate easier registrations for those that are operating in multiple countries. This is essential to ensure that producers can use the same format everywhere in the EU to facilitate compliance. Second, what the producers need to do is appoint an authorized representative in member states that they sell their products in, if they are established in another member state. And then with regards to producers from non-EU countries, member states can also require them to appoint an authorized representative, but this is up to each individual member state, so it is not a mandatory requirement, but more as an option. Third obligation is to join a PRO, so a producer responsibility organization, and authorize it to fulfill the EPR responsibilities. Each member state will set its own criteria that the PRO must fulfill. And there can also be one or more PRO per member state. The directive actually encourages more PROs to create this positive competition that can benefit consumers, lower the costs, and improve the overall systems. Finally, the producers must pay EPR fees to each national PRO where they place products on the market. Maybe one thing to note here is that producers should only pay the EPR fees in the country where their products are most likely to become waste. As the textile value chain is quite complex, it is not uncommon for a product that is placed on the market of one member state to end up finally with an end user in another member state or is disposed in another member state. So basically, it's up to member states to ensure that producers aren't charged twice for those products that move across borders in this way. So just to take the conversation back to the fees, because they are really a core part of the system. Jordan already mentioned, but the structure of the fees that producers pay has to follow basic requirements from the Waste Framework Directive, but the exact amounts and calculations will vary from one member state to another. So the basic requirements are those already mentioned, so they need to be based on weight, where appropriate quantity, and eco-modulation. The eco-modulation should be based on eco-design criteria for products that will be established by the upcoming Textile Delegated Act under the Eco-Design for Sustainable Products regulation that will basically establish the minimum requirements or market access design requirements for textiles. But then again, each member state will have the flexibility to decide on the details of the eco-modulation. Importantly here, the directive gives the Commission the power to adopt legislation to harmonize how eco-modulation criteria is set across the EU. So this harmonization exercise will take place in the future and will be based on these eco-design requirements. Once this is adopted at the EU level, each member state will have to comply with these EU-wide criteria for eco-modulation. Maybe finally to wrap up the obligation part, just to mention that the fees that are paid are then used to fund separate collection, transport, sorting, preparing for reuse, recycling, consumer information campaigns, but also R&D to improve circular design and to scale textile to textile recycling. Maybe worth to mention also other very important actors in the system, which are social economy entities, retailers, public authorities, but also, online marketplaces, fulfillment service providers. But I will not linger much on those as we are, conscious of time. So, thank you for changing the slide. Just to wrap up, when we put all of these elements together, and we know now that the details can vary from one country to another, it's obvious why differences between member states can create a lot of fragmentation across the EU and also complicate cross-border compliance. So whether it's differing rules on EPR reporting, different calculation of EPR fees, etc. So then we have the question of why EPR harmonization is needed at this stage. As you know, member states have until mid-2027, June 2027, to transpose the directive into national law, and latest by April 2028 for EPR schemes to be operational. So now, as member states are on their way to create their national EPR legislation, we are already seeing different approaches on some of the EPR aspects. For example, on how EPR fees are calculated, how eco-modulation is applied, the scope of products even sometimes, and which activities EPR fees can fund. We also know from experience with non-textile EPR systems like packaging EPR, how these differences also in reporting formats, auditing procedures, registration requirements, and payment calendars can significantly create high compliance costs and also result in data incomparability between different countries. Yeah, thank you. So this conversation now comes at the moment when the EU has launched an overall simplification agenda, which is a broader effort to reduce administrative burdens and to make compliance easier and more predictable for companies. So this is also where our EPR discussion fits in. So it's not anymore about whether EPR is needed. There is a consensus that this is needed and why it's needed, but the focus is now on how to make it less complex, especially for producers, right, operating across multiple member states. So we have two EU instruments that are particularly relevant, upcoming instruments. So it's the Environmental Omnibus, which we expect to play a key role, and the Circular Economy Act. So the Environmental Omnibus is a key piece of legislation, which is expected to be published on 3rd December, so in 2 weeks' time, very soon. What the name itself means is that, this is essentially a new legislative proposal, but the name Omnibus means that it modifies already existing pieces of environmental legislation, where the EU has identified margin for simplification and reduction of administrative burdens. So the main purpose of this legislation is to avoid duplication of obligations across different environmental legislation and to streamline and simplify reporting, for example, across different laws. So we expect the Waste Framework Directive to have a very important role here, and we expect the focus to be on reporting obligations, EPR-related reporting obligations, as this is one of the areas where we see a highest risk of fragmentation. We do expect steps to streamline this. For example, the data that must be reported, but also the reporting formats, timelines for reporting, etc. What we also expect is an introduction of the so-called one-stop shop for EPR registration, which would be a single digital entry point that would make it easier for producers to register across the EU. We also expect harmonized rules on appointing authorized representatives, which is also important for simplifying cross-border compliance. Now, putting aside these administrative harmonization elements of EPR schemes, there are also other elements that are not administrative, but which, if harmonized, we see that could potentially significantly improve the effectiveness of EPR schemes. And here is where we see the upcoming Circular Economy Act potentially playing a key role. So Circular Economy Act is a new regulation, so it's a different type of legislative initiative. Regulation applies directly to everyone. However, it will come a bit later, so expected publication is in late 2026. And the purpose, the objective of the Circular Economy Act is to help create a market demand for secondary materials and a single market for waste, and to identify and address the barriers that are slowing down the uptake of recycling in the EU at the moment. So in this context, we also see a margin for update of the Waste Framework Directive and the EPR schemes, as well as, of course, the extended, the key elements of extended producer responsibility. And my colleague Marina will take you through these elements in more detail a bit later. But maybe just to name a few areas, we see, for example, a need to harmonize the list of activities that can be funded through EPR fees. If each member state define this list differently, it can really lead to inconsistent cost coverage. We also see a need to harmonize further how fees are calculated. There is also a question of operational and financial model for the PROs, where we see different approaches emerging. So overall, to sum up, we see both the Environmental Omnibus and the Circular Economy Act as key opportunities to improve consistency and reduce burdens and make sure that textile EPR schemes develop in a way that is most effective, but also that brings the most environmental benefits across the EU. So I can now maybe take a few questions.
Maybe, Kate, if I may, I saw a question that it was very interesting. Is about the difference between eco-modulation and also on the EPR fees, and maybe that is like useful as well, like to explain like the difference between the two on the volumes placed on the market, but also like on the design, the product design, and what is the difference between the two, how they combine together. So the one, if you want to take that that one.
Sure. If I understand correctly, the question is on the difference between eco-modulation and
EPR fees, basically the basic fee.
Okay. So yeah, maybe to simplify, the Waste Framework Directive says that EPR fees must be structured with a few elements. So these elements are, as we already said, weight. It can be a number, it doesn't have to be, but it also eco-modulation. So weight plus or no number plus eco-modulation. The eco-modulation, basically the criteria on which the eco-modulation is to be applied will be based on the upcoming eco-design requirements for textile products, which are coming under another piece of legislation. So these will set eco-design requirements, basically minimum requirements on recyclability, recycled content, durability. Can be also other parameters, but yeah, on the basis of those requirements, eco-modulation will then be set. I don't know if I'm capturing the question correctly because I didn't see the actual question, sorry.
I think it's perfect. There are a couple of questions on those poems. I also see like, will the Environmental Omnibus and Circular Economy Act also have an effect on other pieces of legislation and other directives? So I don't know if you want to take that one as well.
So the Environmental Omnibus, well, we will have to see. As I mentioned, the Environmental Omnibus is not going to introduce any new requirements, but is going to take existing, so other legislation that already exists, and amend certain aspects of it. So for sure, we will see a rolling effect there. The idea is for the Environmental Omnibus to capture a wide range of existing laws. The Circular Economy Act should be a new law by itself, but surely there will be certain spillover effects to other existing legislation as well.
Thank you, Kata, Marina. Axel, I saw you put your hand up. Maybe we ask you to put your question towards the end, because I do want to do my duties as chair and move us on so we can keep to track. The feedback from some of my colleagues is that there are a huge number of questions coming through. Please continue to put them through. Like I mentioned at the beginning, and I reiterate, we might not get to them live, but we will get to them even after the call. Maybe we'll produce a FAQ document and share that with everybody that answers all questions. So please do keep sending them if you have questions. They're very much appreciated. But for now, I will move on and give a little bit of an overview about some of the key considerations and best practices for designing EPR schemes for textiles. So, of course, the types of products included under the EPR scheme, that's a super important point to clarify at the beginning of designing the scheme. I went through the scope required under the EU already, so I won't reiterate that. But I will say that it's also quite important to consider whether any exemptions to the scope are necessary. So, for example, perhaps business and commercial textiles may want to be included or exempted, depending on the desires of the scheme. And also the categorization of the product scope, that's also quite important. So pros must require data reports from producers in the format that's listed in one of the annexes of the EU Waste Framework Directive. But importantly, the pros may, however, require producers to filter their sales declarations into additional subcategories if they wish to do so. And when deciding on whether or not to adopt additional products scope subcategories, it's quite important to ensure that sufficient data on the types of textile products being placed on the market is gathered as per the needs of the reuse recycling operators, although without putting too much unnecessary administrative burden on the producers that will actually have to report that data in practice. Defining the types of companies that would be classed as producers under the EPR scheme is crucial to maximising the volume of waste textiles captured in the EPR scheme, including consideration of any exemptions. Perhaps exemptions for specific sectors or companies below a size threshold would be necessary. And this can include defining producers in a way that ensures that online sales are captured in the scheme, including direct-to-consumer fast fashion type sales. When you're designing and implementing an EPR scheme for a new waste stream like textiles, a lot of time can be saved if learnings from pre-existing EPR schemes in the country for other waste streams are reviewed. So, for example, existing EPR schemes for things like product packaging or waste electronics. And it may even be possible for different EPR schemes and the pros of those EPR schemes to collaborate and potentially replicate the practices and platforms for the new textiles EPR schemes. So that might include things like producer registration processes or data reporting mechanisms, and maybe even procedures for receiving and then disseminating the EPR fee payments. And quite obviously, well, not obviously, but of course, the EPR schemes that already exist, they will have a pretty good oversight of the existing waste collection and recycling infrastructure and the capacity within that country that already exists. So that is very transferable knowledge. Regarding the creation of the producer responsibility organisations, there are a few different major considerations about permitting how they would actually operate. Do you want to just have one pro to facilitate the ease of registration and simplicity, or do you want to permit more than one pro to be operating so that it encourages a kind of competitive environment? Are there going to be any prerequisites for the pro governance structure? Do they need to make sure that they're engaging certain aspects of the industry in their decision making? What's the legal status of the pro? Quite commonly for EPR, it would be a non-profit legal status, so that any profits go directly back into the investment in the success of the scheme, but that's not always the case. Consideration for historic textiles. Yeah, will a new EPR scheme consider and finance the collection and processing of textiles that were placed on the market before the EPR scheme was implemented? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. Depends on what the country and region would like to do. It's very important to ensure that the nation's existing textiles value chain is adequately represented in the operation of a new EPR scheme. And that can be achieved through things like creating an industry steering group or some sort of advisory committee. It's essential to create a process and a format for producers to submit textiles placed on the market data. Including frequency that the PRO will require producers to report and deadlines for the report submissions. It's, at least in the EU and well, for almost every country around the world that has textiles EPR, you need to ensure that a separate collection network for used textiles is operational with nationwide coverage, including trying to integrate existing collection schemes that are already operational into that network. So things like clothing banks and pre-existing retailer take-back schemes. And to ensure that all obligated companies are paying into the EPR scheme, creation of a process and a format for producers to register with a producer responsibility organisation is, again, essential. It may also be appropriate to consider some sort of simplified registration procedure for SMEs to try and minimise the administrative burden that's placed on them. And as well as the process and the platform to allow producers to register, it should also be noted that in the European Union, at least, a national producer register must be created, either by the regulator or the PRO themselves. And that national producer register, it must list the producers that are registered in the National Textiles EPR scheme and also provide hyperlinks to equivalent producer registers in other EU countries. And that the purpose of that is to try and facilitate producer registration in other countries. During the webinar so far, I've spoken quite a lot about producers having to pay EPR fees into the schemes, although I haven't really spoken about how the value of the EPR fees that need to be paid are calculated or gone into any details around the fees themselves. But like Kata pointed out quite diligently, the EPR fees of textiles EPR schemes, they will vary from country to country. And the reason is because really they try and represent the real costs of collecting, sorting and treating used textiles. And different countries have different waste management infrastructure available, hence the costs will change. But in essence, the EPR fees that are charged to producers, they should capture 100% of the true costs of used and waste textile collection, transportation, sorting, reuse, repair, recycling, and, if necessary, treatment and other types of disposal. But why is it important? So calculating the true costs and then dividing the costs for the amount of textiles placed on the market in the first instance, that kind of allows EPR fees to be determined per product. But I do want to supplement that comment by saying that is, of course, a very simple fee calculation methodology, but it's just to give some context to that slide. The fees, they also need to be eco-modulated to incentivize producers to sell more sustainable products in the first instance. And the eco-modulation of EPR fees essentially means the producers of easier to recycle or more durable products pay discounted EPR fees, and producers of harder to recycle products, they pay less. Producers of harder to recycle or less durable products, they pay penalty style EPR fees, so they pay a little bit more. And the concept of eco-modulation that I just explained is simple enough to understand, but the criteria that producers need to satisfy for the discounts needs to be set, which can become a little bit more complex, i.e. precisely what qualifies a product to be more durable or more recyclable than another product. Waste hierarchy prioritization, that is particularly important for textiles, like I've already highlighted, because it's mandatory in the EU to prioritize the waste hierarchy. In my head, there's a couple of key channels for waste hierarchy prioritization in the EU, partly through the EPR scheme and the legislation itself. So that can be achieved through things like maybe integrating mandatory reuse targets into the legislation, like has been done in the Netherlands, or maybe adopting take-back obligations for retailers and things like that. But the waste hierarchy, it can also be prioritized through the PROs too. So there's quite a range of methods available to pros to prioritize the hierarchy. So they might, yes, eco-modulate fees, like we've already spoken about, but they also can do things like focusing their consumer awareness campaigns on improving the perception of reuse, or even going as far as offering repair vouchers to consumers to encourage it. There are two types of awareness campaigns which are linked to EPR schemes, one being targeted at businesses, and the purposes of those campaigns are to ensure that all obligated producers are actually aware of their obligations and register accordingly. And those campaigns, they uphold the fairness of the EPR scheme and make sure that it's proportionately funded by obligated producers. And there's also a different style, awareness campaigns targeted at consumers. And that's really to help consumers understand their role in the EPR schemes and what they are supposed to do to facilitate and foster the correct sorting and disposal of used textiles once they reach the end of their life. Whenever I talk about operating successful EPR schemes, I always mention how important it is to make sure there's good enforcement mechanisms, because if an EPR scheme is not adequately enforced, then 100% of the costs to collect and treat all textiles which arise as waste on the market, they're borne only by the producers that are compliant with the mandatory EPR obligations. So if 100% of companies placing new textile products on the market are not paying their EPR fees, the compliant producers that are registered, they're paying unfairly high fees. And additionally, if new producers entering the market see very low levels of enforcement, they may choose not to comply with the scheme to save themselves some money, recognizing that detection of non-compliance with the EPR scheme is unlikely. There's a number of ways for non-compliant free riders to be addressed. The most obvious is direct fines for companies identified as being non-compliant with EPR. But there are also various methods available to the pros to try and minimize the levels of free riding. Information sharing. So sometimes EPR schemes have information sharing duties embedded within them. So for example, the EU Waste Framework Directive, that requires the pros to publish information on their websites about the number of products placed on the market, the rate of separate collection of used and waste textiles achieved, and as well as the reuse rates, preparation for reuse and recycling rates, the rates of fibre to fibre recycling that are actually achieved, and also the rates of other recycling and disposal methods. And I think also data on export levels too, which is quite important for transparency. The EU Framework Directive, it also requires producers to finance and coordinate the completion of surveys on collected municipal waste. Those surveys need to be completed every 5 years on a mandatory level. It can be very useful to try and map the end destinations of used and waste textiles. And that helps the PRO to consider, if they want to, how they could support, financial or otherwise support, countries in the global south that have to deal with the burden of managing waste textiles, which were first placed on the market in the global north. Coming to end markets for recyclates, to foster a truly circular economy, a strategy to support end markets with recycler application and capacity scaling that needs to be adopted. So if recyclates aren't actually used in the production of new products, the process of collecting and sorting and eventually recycling used products, that can become a little bit somewhat redundant because the recycled content is never actually being used in practice. And I have an example here noted down on my notes. The EPR Pro for farm plastics in Ireland, they actively work with their industry to support the application of recycled plastic waste into new products. New products like piping and damp-proofing sheets and refuse sacks, things like that. And lastly, performance review. Of course, you want to measure how the scheme is performing so you can make adaptations and help it improve on a continuous basis over time. That's enough for me. I'm going to skip questions and hold them to the end just to help us push to time, but we will get to all of your questions at the end, like I keep reiterating. But for now, I will pass back over to Policy Hub, who will give us some insights into the industry perception that could or should influence policy design, specifically around EPR. So Policy Hub, back over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Jordan. So maybe if we can move to the next slide.
Oh, sorry about that. That's my fault. There we go.
It's perfect. So yeah, as I said at the beginning, at Policy Hub, we have been engaging with European institutions in the context of the Waste Framework Directive since the very beginning, since the Commission published the revision of the Waste Framework Directive and focus on the implementation of the textile EPR schemes. So what you see here is a very general overview of the key points that we have been flagging in the conversations and that we have been prioritizing in the context of the discussions and conversation for the Waste Framework Directive, but also like we are including those points in our engagement and conversations we're having at the moment on the implementation of EPR schemes. As Katarina also said, we are also like engaging and conveying all of these messages. Modified a little bit according to the last final version of the Waste Framework Directive and the final text, but also like trying to convey the idea that each of these poems brings in the context of the Circular Economy Act and most importantly on the Environment Omnibus. We are still waiting a couple of elements on what we call secondary legislation as well in the context of Waste Framework Directive. One on everything related to the harmonization of reporting on the registration to the producers register. Also like in everything related to eco-modulation. So we are also like engaging on those elements and trying to convey the key elements that we have in here to the policymakers and decision makers. To summarize very briefly, also like conscious of time, and the key elements that we have been flagging is the need for strong and effective collaboration among waste treatment operators. Also clarity on the funded activities and harmonization as much as possible to provide legal clarity and certainty on the mechanism, but also the introduction of like an effective EPR scheme. So if we go into more details into those points, let's start with a strong and effective collaboration. So for us, this is one of the key elements that we not only have in the context of Waste Framework Directive, but also in Circular Economy Act, in the conversation of end of waste criteria for textiles as well, is that it is fundamental to introduce a mechanism that ensures there is a strong and effective collaboration among these waste treatment operators, like the collection of textile waste and the sorting processes, in order like to really enhance textile to textile recycling, to really move forward with the improvement of what is needed for improving the recyclability status in the European Union, but also like to foster this robust market for secondary raw materials in the EU single market. The problem that we see right now in the final text of the Waste Framework Directive right now is that there are like hints to this need in the text, but it's not clear clarity on how this will be obtained or how this will be ensured. So that leave us in a situation where it's like hard like to see what will be the specific way forward, an element like to advance. The problem also like we see is that if there is no clarity here, there will be potentially too many local solutions, or maybe like very divergent and various like textile waste management systems, or that do not combine, or like do not are like similar or harmonized, and that move us away a little bit, like having this like economy of scale for the secondary raw material market, but also like for this like collaboration among the different actors. Relevant and like also like very much related to this is everything related to the need for a clear list of funded activities. Katarina mentioned this in the previous slides. But for us, this is fundamental, like to harmonize as well what kind of activities can be funded by the EPR fees. But more importantly, is like to have clear definitions of what each of the funded activities really mean for each of the cases. One very practical example is on everything related to preparation for recycling. Within preparation for recycling is a key element that needs to be funded by EPR fees. The issue that we have right now with the final text of the Waste Framework Directive is that it's not clear the definition that a preparation for recycling has in the text, so that will be leading to different divergences, different interpretations in the process, and also like having like not like this proper relationship potentially, and this communication between collectors, sorters, and recyclers. So we see like those like elements also like huge margin for clarification, but also for harmonization. We also like put in here the point that EPR fees should cover essential waste management costs, prioritize a building infrastructure for textile waste management that doesn't exist yet. For us, this is a core element of EPR funding schemes, because in the conversations we have been having, EPR schemes have been placed and have been like introduced to advance in the conversation of recycling, of like building an infrastructure in the European Union that is able like to manage textile waste in the single market, and like to also have like all these like different elements coming together with we mentioned the interrelation between eco-design for sustainable products regulation, recycled content, recyclability, and the introduction of like robust EPR fees as well, like to cover and to complete all the different pieces of the puzzle. When it comes to effective EPR schemes, one of the key points that we have been discussing internally, also like conveying to the institutions here in Brussels and to the different stakeholders involved in the process, is the need for this EPR scheme to cover all actors, including micro enterprises, especially for the textile sector, just like to apply the logic of the EPR objectives, so extended producer responsibility also like will be different from one actor to the other, depending on the weight and the number of products placed on the market and the co-modulation as well. But we don't see the reason like to leave out like certain actors from the conversation on EPR scheme. That's why we have been advocating for the inclusion of all the different actors within the scope. One of the points as well that have been introduced in the final text, and we have been flagging several times in several conversations, is on everything related to these concerns on the inclusion of sorting for proximity in the Waste Framework Directive. Basically, because the way of understanding how to create economy of scale for the recycling sector and for the management of textile waste is like to have this perspective broader in the EU single market, and like to also like have like this coordination, collaboration between different member states, but also like to understand that a certain like product will have better like capacity to be recycled or treated in certain member states than in others. So that's why it is like needed like to have this more overall general perspective on the sorting and on the treatment of this textile waste. So that's why we have been flagging the concern that we have on the concept. Basically, most importantly, because there is no legal clarity on what sorting for proximity means and on the potential divergences that this will cause to the system. Well, you have heard from Katarina before, you have heard like from me now as well. Harmonization for us is one of the key elements in this conversation. We are engaging with different actors, with different the different institutions, and like doing several things to call for as much harmonization as possible in the implementation of the system. That's why like all these like areas for further clarity and certainty in the implementation of the scheme is very much needed. Also, one of the points that we put in the different letters and the positions, that we have been flagging to the institutions, is on these mechanisms to ensure this strong PRO coordination, so the Producer Responsibility Organizations coordination, to have this conversation on what is effective regional and EU sorting, but also like to ensure there is like this efficient way of communicating and collaborating and exchanging on the information, always respecting the union laws on confidentiality and competitive, but also like to have this conversation on what is working, what is needed, what are the decisions. So to have this strong PRO coordination among the different member states, different PROs. Then of course is everything related to the need for a reimbursement mechanism. I saw also questions in the chat in the previous points being discussed. The point on placing on the market versus making available in the market of a member state has been one of the most the trickiest points in the conversation for the past years. It took us several meetings, conversations with different stakeholders, with different policy members as well, to see what will be the implications of having a term or the other, and the need for the introduction of this reimbursement mechanism to make sure that the fees are paid on the market where the product has the greatest, the biggest probability of becoming waste, but also to avoid double payments between different PROs, different member states. So in the end, in the Waste Framework Directive, we have the reference to making available in the market. And also I can put in the chat later the specific legal wording of what it means to make available in the market, because it's also a question on that point. But there is only one recital, so only one, the way recital means in the piece of legislation, there is a section that is mostly explaining the intention of the Commission for introducing the law, but there is only one piece saying that member states should collaborate and should make sure there will be mechanisms that will avoid and will to have double payments in the implementation of EPR schemes. But there is no clear call for a reimbursement mechanism. There is nothing clear on how this could be achieved. So that is why we have been calling for the definition for the introduction of a proper reimbursement mechanism to make sure everything works properly. As I said, harmonization is one of the key words that you will be hearing from us, but also in EU conversations. And if we move to the next slide, we go more into the details on what harmonization means. Wonderful. So we have divided everything between these administrative burdens, EPR fees, PRO model, and other key areas. Most of these points have been mentioned by Katarina before. But for us, key areas that we are calling for harmonization, legal clarity, is mostly on standardizing the reporting obligations, but also like the single frequency of the single annual reporting period. We're also like calling for this one-stop shop for the reporting and registration for the different producers, like to have everything merged in one single place, like to facilitate this registration. We know that from the Commission perspective, this is going to be one of the key priorities in the upcoming Environment Omnibus. So on the 3rd of December, we will know more. And to also simplify the process for designating an authorized representative. If you take the text of the Waste Framework Directive, the final one, you will see there is this obligation that also, like Katarina mentioned, of designating an authorized representative in each member state. So by each producer should be designated an authorized representative in every member state. So we are asking for a simplification of this because it's moving away from the simplification of the implementation of the EPR scheme, but also it's moving the attention from more implementing efficient EPR and like advancing to the core objective of EPR and making this more administrative burden. We're also calling for harmonization of EPR fees calculation and harmonization of eco-modulation criteria. We have put this in bold because it's fundamental for the eco-modulation criteria. However, as I said before, the Commission is already planning to do this. However, we don't know when this will happen. And I also saw a lot of questions in the chat flagging whether recycled content will be considered, whether this will be taken at the portfolio or product level approach, whether durability will be included. We don't know yet because that conversation is happening in the context of eco-design for sustainable products regulation in the delegated act for textile, that the process is already going on at the moment. But yeah, basically we will need to wait until that is finished and to see like the Commission working on eco-modulation. What we are asking is for this eco-modulation criteria to be harmonized in a timely manner, and also like to do this like in parallel to the exercise on ESPR conversation, to not wait until 2027, like to have this finalized. As I said, the list of activities that can be funded by EPR fees, we're also calling for this. And then on everything related to the harmonization of the operational and financial payroll model to clarify textile waste ownership. I also saw a question in the chat flagging like who is owning the containers for the collection of textile waste. That is precisely like the kind of questions that we are also like wondering and asking for further clarification. And I think that also like is the reason why we're asking for this harmonization of the operational model of the payroll to respond to those kind of questions like who owns the textile waste, the revenue, the cost streams, so all these different elements also included in the conversation. As I said, coordination and collaboration between PROs to harmonize on how to support research and innovation. These areas need to have further harmonization of what is understood by these activities, and to also like to create this legal clarity in the process. And finally, final call like to complement EPR schemes with the funding, the risking, and the innovation tools to create something that is working and effective and is practical and efficient. But yeah, thank you, Jordan.
No, thank you, Marina. That's great. And thank you for answering questions from the chat whilst you were going through. That's really useful. We have some more slides towards the end to summarise some of our recent working experience on designing textiles EPR schemes for some key EU countries like Ireland and Germany, a little bit Australia. But I am going to take an executive decision and just say we will send you those slides with the deck, and we'll spend the last 6 minutes that we have to quickly answer some of the questions that we've gone through. So I will answer a couple of the questions that I've noted down whilst Marina was speaking, and then perhaps I can pass back to Policy Hub Hub to see if there's any other questions that they want to answer at a final level. We will send you all of these recordings and the slides like I promised, but for now let's answer some questions, and I will put it on a holding slide so you can all see that. I saw one question around who is specifically classed as a micro enterprise that do not have to comply for a year later. That is defined by at the European level. So a micro enterprise has a turnover of less than 2 million euros per year, or less than 10 employees, I think is the definition. And I also saw another question which was asking, how are EPR fees usually eco-modulated to incentivize circular design? Well, how they're usually eco-modulated is hard to answer, because there's only a couple of countries which actively do that for textiles right now as of today, even though it will be mandatory for a lot of countries to do that in the very near future. But I will speak to those examples. Like I say before, in France, there's currently 3 eco-modulation levels. One which tries to encourage the design of more durable and resistant products, and another which encourages the integration of recycled content. And to give more flavour on that, producers that integrate 15% recycled fibres sourced from post-consumer textiles, like I say before, they can receive a 50% discount on their EPR fees. And then the second example, which I plucked out whilst Marina was speaking, in Australia, the voluntary scheme that incentivizes product recyclability specifically rather than durability. So scheme members are rewarded with a 25% reduction in their fees, in the fees that they pay for each garment that meets specific eco-modulation criteria around product recyclability. Again, more specifically, the garments qualify for a discount if they have a primary material made from a mono material or a single fiber at a rate of at least 95%. Thereby, if it's only made from one type of fiber, it's easier to recycle. Hence they're getting the discount. Policy Hub, are there any key questions which you really wanted to jump onto so you can answer those?
I think there was like a very good one on, someone put the link on the new, on the new legislative framework, and what is like the relevance on like having like between like environment omnibus, circular economy act, new legislative framework as well, and the waste framework directive. So I think it's like also like useful like to explain a little bit like the relationship between all of those pieces, and maybe like to explain what is like the intention behind. So maybe very quickly, because like Katarina, you mentioned before as well, difference between environment omnibus that is opening a drawer, taking all the pieces of legislation and see which areas can be simplified for what we already have on the table. Circular Economy Act is a new instrument, putting like identifying those gaps and levers like to contribute to the secondary raw material market. And then the new legislative framework is this like revision, like to see how we can make sure there is like a strong operationalization compliance mechanism for the different pieces of legislation. So it's mostly revising and like assessing which pieces are needed to ensure that the rules are everyone complies with the rule, and that there's a even level playing field in the European Union. So it's like all the conversation on what is the role of the TW passport in ensuring compliance with different pieces of legislation, for example. So that conversation is mostly taking place in the context of the new legislative framework. So I hope that that's also like helps a little bit, placing all the cards of the puzzle, put everything together. So yeah.
That's great. Thank you so much, Marina. We are at time. So thank you for everybody who submitted questions. If we didn't get to them, like I say, we'll answer them before. But more importantly, thank you for attending live and joining the session. You will still receive a recording like everybody else. Lastly, thank my colleague Sophie and the very valuable inputs from our colleagues over at Policy Hub. But I wish you all a lovely rest of your day, afternoon if it's morning for you, or evening if it's afternoon for you. Thank you for joining, and expect to receive the content from us soon. But yeah, that's a wrap. Excuse the pun. Thank you for joining.
Bye bye. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone.